Mark surprised me and excited me when he said, "I don't have anything to say." That's the first time I've heard that, and here I thought I was going to have a lot more time to teach, but no apologies needed. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. We're going to finish the book of 1 Corinthians tonight, one way or the other. We're going to begin in verse 20. Verse 20. Paul is instructing the Corinthians about the Lord's Supper. Partaking of the Lord's Supper in the church at Corinth at that time was a lot different than partaking of the Lord's Supper in the church that meets at Alkire Road. How was that participation different from your knowledge of this chapter? So apparently they, had fellowship meals like we have fellowship meals, and they had morphed the fellowship meal and the Lord's Supper together. It had become truly a supper. They were eating, or at least some of them were. And that was one of the abuses, is that they were eating the meal, the Lord's Supper, as a meal, not as it was intended to be at all. The other abuse was that some were eating and some weren't. Some who had money and had food brought in abundance and ate in abundance, and those who were poor of the brethren weren't eating and went hungry. Some ate their fill and probably beyond, and some weren't. Now, the church at Corinth, we're not told specifically, at this time where they were meeting. Probably in someone's house, maybe outside the house. At the very most, it was probably maybe a public setting. Probably wasn't as big as our fellowship room. But, can you imagine brethren eating together like that, or not eating together like that? Some had a bunch of food over here at this table, and they were huddled around their food, and others didn't. And Paul says, I can't praise you for that. He says you're humiliating or you're shaming those who don't have food. It's hard to imagine brethren treating each other like that. But yet that's what was going on in Corinth. And so it wasn't as if they had this huge arena where they didn't know what was going on at the other end, and they couldn't see people who didn't have food. They were, undoubtedly as close as we are tonight, and acting like this. And so he tells them in verse 20, he says, when you come together, he says, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. In other words, what you're doing isn't eating the Lord's Supper. You're not participating or partaking of the Lord's Supper as it was intended to be partaken of. In eating, one takes his own supper ahead of others. And that was another thing. They weren't even waiting on each other for all of them to get there at the same time. Some started ahead of time and were eating when others were arriving. And so he said, in eating, each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry and another is drunk. What? Do you not know you have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. And he's repeating what he said in the verse 17. He says, I can't praise you for this. I can't commend you for what you're doing. And so he goes on to instruct them on how to properly partake of the Lord's Supper. Verse 23, he says, for I received from the Lord that which I have also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus on the same night in which he was betrayed took bread. Paul reminds them that what he taught them, and you know that while Paul was with them, and how long was he with them? when he established the congregation there? Year and a half. You know they were partaking of this Lord's Supper the way they should be partaking of it during that year and a half. Paul wouldn't have had it any other way. It may have been 4 or 5 years since he had been there and established the congregation, and in that short time, the Lord's Supper had evolved into what it was, the way they were doing it. And so he says, I'm going to tell you what I received from the Lord. How did he receive that from the Lord? I think it's important that we catch this, is that he's not teaching them something that he made up. He's not teaching them something that he heard from some other teacher. He says, I received this from the Lord directly. And he received it through revelation. Paul mentioned a couple of different times, at least in the New Testament, the idea that he received what he taught directly from the Lord. That's what Galatians chapter 1 is about. He wanted to make sure that those Christians there, as he does here in this congregation, knows that what they were being taught was told to him directly from the Lord. And so he goes on and he says, and when in verse 24, and when he had given thanks, speaking of Jesus, he broke it and said, take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you. This do in remembrance of me. And in the same manner he also took the cup after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as ye drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. So he repeats what the Lord had said to his disciples when he initiated the Lord's Supper in the upper room. And I want you to go back to Exodus chapter 24 for a moment. Exodus chapter 24. In verse 25 of this chapter, he says, the cup is the new covenant in my blood. Now that's might be kind of confusing to some people. Exodus chapter 24 and verse 7 and 8. The context here is when Moses is sharing the law of Moses with the Israelites for the first time. He's initiating the law of Moses. And in verse 7 it says, then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you according to all these words. So Moses took the blood and physically sprinkled the people with that blood. Now, if we go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 11, when the Lord instituted the Lord's Supper, he gave the cup to the disciples and said, this is the blood of the covenant, or the covenant in my blood. Essentially, he was saying this symbolizes the blood which is going to be used to establish the new law. And figuratively, those who are disciples of Christ have been sprinkled with the blood of Christ, right? When we're baptized, we're washed of our sins with that blood. And in a figurative way, we are sprinkled as were those Israelites in the Old Testament, physically sprinkled. Back to verse 24. Take this, or take, eat, this is my body which is broken. Some people have a problem with this, saying, you know, how is this possible? I didn't think any of Jesus' bones were broken. And that is true. They weren't, but his flesh was broken. And then that's the meaning of verse 24 here. We use that today. I was a paper boy, as many of you were, and you know, dogs were a constant threat. And if you had a paper route for any length of time, you got bit. And I know the first thing my mom always asked me when I come home, I told her I got bit by a dog. what would she say? Did it break the flesh, right? Did it break the flesh? Why? Because, that's where infection can begin if the flesh is broken. And in that same way, Jesus' body was broken as well. Certainly the spikes that went through his hands and his feet, and the sword that went through his side, and the thorns that went into his head, and the whips that went across his back broke his body, his flesh. And so there's no contradiction there in the Scriptures. Questions or comments? Okay. Okay. Good. ESV. Doesn't say broken. Okay. Anyone else? Verse 27. Therefore, whosoever eats this bread and drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. How do we eat and drink the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner? Okay. Our minds are not focused on what we're supposed to be focused on at that particular time. How else might we eat and drink the Lord's Supper unworthily? Okay. Living a lifestyle that is hypocritical and not in alignment with God's Word. Yep. Sure. Good. Done. Yeah. Well, I think so. I think that's part of what he's going to say in the next verse, that we're to examine ourselves. And as a part of that examination, is an inward examination, and if we do have aught against our brother, we should take care of it before we partake of the Lord's Supper. Now, I don't think we should come to church, and say, well, I got this problem, and I'm not worthy. I think we need to take care of it. Make sure we take care of it ahead of time. Any issues that may hinder us from partaking of it in a proper manner, we ought to eliminate those before we come to services and get that out of the way. Because it hinders not only this part of our worship, but it has a bearing on all of our worship to God. It's part of that, coming to worship God in spirit and in truth. The right attitude. Anyone else?
Well, you do like to pray this, make a common meal out of it, not doing it in the correct way.
Yeah, absolutely. It's another way of partaking of it in an unworthy manner. We could substitute the emblems for something other than what is prescribed in the New Testament. That would be partaking of an unworthy manner. Okay, there's another way. Partaking of it on a day that's unprescribed in the New Testament. So if someone comes to you and says to you, well, I think we can partake of the Lord's Supper any day of the week, how are you going to respond to them? Okay. And specifically, that's a good answer. It's just, how would you follow up with that? Okay. So we don't have an example of Christians partaking of the Lord's Supper on any other day other than Sunday, the first day of the week. And so the burden of proof is on them to find another day or another example, some teaching in the New Testament to show that it's authorized to partake of the Lord's Supper on a day other than Sunday. Okay? So, verse 28, well, before we go to 28, verse 27, the last part says, if we partake of the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner, we're guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. I mean, it's as if we are crucifying him ourselves. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 29, it talks about those who just disregard the sacrifice that was made for them. Verse 29 says, of how much worse punishment do you suppose will he be thought worthy who has trampled the Son of God underfoot and counted the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified or made holy a common thing and insulted the Spirit of grace? You think of that imagery of trampling the Son of God underfoot, just stomping on somebody. We look at that and we see videos of people doing that to other people, and how despicable is that? But that's what we're doing to the Lord, in essence, when we partake of the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. We're disregarding or counting the blood of the covenant that washed our sins away as a common thing. So as we partake of the Lord's Supper and, we're whispering or to our neighbor, or we're joking around, or we're just letting our mind go here and there and everywhere and not focused on what we're supposed to be focused on, then we're counting the blood of the covenant as a common thing. There's nothing special about it. It's just ordinary thing. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. The blood of Christ is not ordinary. It's not common. And so it's very serious that we partake of the supper in a right way. Verse 28, 1 Corinthians 11. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. And we've talked about a bit about this examination that we're supposed to do. It's something that we need to be sure that we're in a position to partake of it in a right way. Now, some people say, "Oh, I'm not worthy to partake of it," and you know what? None of us are worthy to partake of it. It doesn't say that. It says, "Don't partake of it in an unworthy way, in an unworthy manner." So that's what the blood of Christ does. It covers our imperfections. Verse 29. For he who eats and drinks in an unworthy manner eats and drinks judgment to himself, not discerning the Lord's body. So the word judgment, you could substitute the word condemnation there. And so when we partake of it incorrectly, we're condemning ourselves before the Lord because we don't discern it. That word discern means to recognize a difference or to discriminate. Again, this idea that the sacrifice of Christ is something really special to us as Christians, particularly because that's what makes us right in the sight of God. And so we need to discern the Lord's body when we partake of this. In other words, His death.
Do you think, I look at this as he's, when we read it, it's almost like we're taking it, we're listening to it, but he was probably scolding these people pretty heavily because he was talking about their disorder back in verse 20. And now we get to this point. We're elaborating a little bit on different things that you can be unworthy about. But I can imagine these people were pretty uncomfortable because they knew what they've been doing for
Yeah.
this whole time.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, when you get down to verse 32, he kind of addresses that. He says, but when you are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned by with the world. So he was saying, I'm chastening you. I'm an apostle. I'm chastening you. I'm correcting you, but it's for your own good. It's not for your bad. It's not for your condemnation. It's to help you keep from being condemned. And so, he's bearing down on them pretty hard, but he also wants them to know the point of the discipline. Just as a father or a mother disciplines their children, right? Done correctly, it's for their good. So he knows he's coming down on them hard, and he wanted to temper that. Yeah, and he's in verse 30, very next verse, he talks about that, the consequences. He says, for this reason, many are weak and sick among you, and many sleep. So the reason that many were weak spiritually, were sick spiritually, and were asleep spiritually was because they weren't partaking of this supper right. So yeah, it is very important. How is it that the Lord's Supper can make somebody spiritually weak? Or another way of asking, how is it that, because the implication is that if you partake of it properly, then you're going to be stronger. You're going to be spiritually healthy. So how is it that the Lord's Supper can make us spiritually strong or spiritually healthy? Okay.
The person who begins to, for example, take the Lord's Supper, they think of it as kind of a talisman. I take this, it takes care of all my problems, and they're not doing anything to take the Lord's Supper. It's not good. They're not good for us.
Okay.
There's a lot of examples like that, people taking it the wrong way.
What is it within those minutes that we partake of the Lord's Supper? What is it that is going to help us spiritually? How?
It's reminding us to, every time we read what Christ went through, it's constant. Every week it's keeping that, reinforcing that in our minds. This is why he did this. It's giving us that strength, hopefully, to continue doing what we're supposed to the best of our abilities to strive to run that good race.
Okay, so when we do it, and we do it right, it reminds us. It reminds us of a debt that we had and was paid for us. And so I believe when we partake of it properly and we're reminded of that, it reminds us that we have to do something for the great price that was paid for us. Okay, Jimmy?
It also teaches humbleness. When we get to thinking that, we're it and everything, when we look back and we're nothing without Christ. And so it makes us, it keeps us humble.
Absolutely. We can do great things, but they're nothing in comparison because and nothing close to paying for our way to heaven. So yes, it keeps us humble. Should. Ed?
I've never read or seen anything that would be interesting to see if there's a correlation if we could ever truly talk to people who have fallen away and wondering at what point they really stopped taking of the Lord's Supper, where it was just an act. Like kids grow up in the church and they just, like you say, pass notes to whatever. That's when it became ordinary, where they didn't focus on it. Soon after, where they basically lost their religion, where it no longer became what it's intended to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's there's a direct correlation. What that is, or what the timing is on that, we don't know. I think as we partake of it each week and we think of it and do it properly, we grow in our appreciation for what Christ has done for us. And when we grow in our appreciation for what He's done, then we begin to realize, what we need to do, what we need to reciprocate as far as our attitude, as far as our emotions, as far as our energies and resources and things like that. I think as our appreciation grows, our love for Christ grows, then we grow spiritually as well. All right. Verse 31. For if we would judge ourselves, we would not be judged. So if we examine ourselves and we're truthful with ourselves, and then we're not going to be judged by the Lord. Verse 32, but when we are judged, we are chastened by the Lord, that we may not be condemned with the world. So it's better to be hard on ourselves, make the changes that we need to make, instead of receiving the condemnation from the Lord in the end. Verse 33, therefore, my brethren, when you come together to eat, wait for one another. The very least you could do is wait for each other. Why is that important? Because we learned in chapter 10 that this meal, this supper that it's not a meal, this supper that we partake of is a communion. And the word for communion is fellowship. When we partake of that supper, we're fellowshipping with one another. Is it possible to fellowship, commune properly when part of the congregation is not even arrived yet? No. So the idea of a communion is that everyone is together in the same place at the same time. But if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home, lest you come together for judgment. And the rest I will set in order when I come. So the meal, the supper is not a meal. It's not to satisfy our appetite. You have homes to do that in. And by doing that, they weren't going to shame their poorer brethren. And they weren't going to abuse the Lord's Supper and make it into a common meal. Any other questions or comments before we go on? Jason? A couple different ways come to mind is the way we do it, and where it's everyone's in the same room, and then there's other way I saw is that those who didn't partake on Sunday morning are allowed to, given time, to go back to a separate room and partake of it. So. Well, I don't think there's any question as to when we all are in the same room at the same time, that we're communing together. There's this idea that when on Sunday night, those of us who have partaken that morning, is there an idea, I'll throw this out to you, is there this idea that we don't have to think about the sacrifice of Christ while the other ones are partaking? Maybe. I mean, I've found myself, looking to see who's up there, wondering why they weren't here this morning, all kinds of different ideas, or just completely, maybe looking through a songbook, who knows what. So I'll get some of my thoughts on that. Megan? Okay. Well, we'll get to that. Let's address this idea of having it together or apart. Okay, Matt?
Also, we would have people come in and just as they come in, once we pass by up front, partake and sit down. And not only do we not online together, but mentally it becomes this passive thing. You know, where we're not all focused on together. It becomes less important. Whereas if you all wait together and everybody's focused on the same thing, the importance then is felt. Whereas if you just kind of one at a time and at your own pace, it becomes less important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like the word tarry in verse 33.
Uh-huh.
You know, I'm at work all day and Joey and the kids go ahead and eat dinner without me, and then when I get home, the dinner's there, they tarry. Even though they're not eating with me, but they tarry, they wait. And that's how I look at Sunday evening. We've tarried for those that were able to attend that morning and still the first day, so we're that program community together.
Yeah. Yeah, and does anyone else have any comments? Mark?
I was reading one of the large congregations in San Antonio, Texas, about 2,000 members. Not only do they take the Lord's Supper on Sunday night, they come and just over a period of an hour, the people will go down, they have a big table, order your own juice, break off a piece of bread, and you have a prayer yourself. You go back to sit, this goes on. As they put it, you go down and the Spirit moves you to do it. That's a totally new approach that I had not heard of before.
Yeah, I've not heard that either. So I think, Jason, to follow up a little bit more on that is that in the congregations I've been at where people partake of it in a separate room, the rest of the congregation continues to worship, continues their worship. And generally, if it's at the end, they'll sing a song, say a prayer, dismiss, while the other people are in the other room. I think that you can't go wrong when you're all in the same room again, and we need to worship together. So I don't see why there's. I think it's safe to do it together, and when you think about the motives for that, I'm thinking that this has probably come about to sort of speed up things, speed up the service. We don't want to sit through that, and it's another 5 minutes or so we have to be here worshiping God. And I suspect that that's part of why this has come about. It's for our convenience. And yeah, that's always a danger. Yeah. So, any other thoughts on that topic, Harold?
There are some in brotherhood that don't think that we should serve on Sunday night because we're not all thinking it. The way I look at it is, we don't live in the time in which it's established. They didn't have shift workers and 2 services a day, probably things like we do to accommodate. And so, being together, that's about the best we can do. The original design was for the whole church to come together and do that, I'm sure. And I don't know if they have more than one service there. A lot of congregations don't have one. All people are be there at every service, and sometimes they just have one. There's nothing wrong with that. Anyone who needs is the best. But I think, like you said, the togetherness is the best we can do under the present situation. I mean, the reverse is really bad to me because who are you to deprive somebody of taking that on the first day of the week just because they didn't do it?
Yeah, I was gonna pose that question.
Yeah, you have to use good common sense. To me, that's the way I look at it.
For those people who only are able to make it on Sunday night, they sit through a service. If you don't offer them the communion, have they truly worshiped? Not completely, because they haven't partaken of the Lord's Supper. And so, it's you either have to do it all or none of it, because partial isn't going to cut it. We're supposed to worship the way God told us to. Yes?
Just add a note
That's right. Yeah. Good. Any other questions? All right. Okay, Megan, we're going to address the one cup. So, what was your question? Okay. So, I think I know how I would answer that. Does anyone else want to provide a response to that? If someone says to you, hey, talks about one cup, how do we say that?
How big does the cup have to be for 3,000 to drink out of?
Okay. Yeah.
Well, that says the cup, so it's the cup that they use, so do we need that cup?
Okay.
We don't drink the cup.
Right.
He said drink the cup, he's talking about the contents.
Right.
And of course, in India, they do use one cup, but I've been able to have a tray like 24, they keep filling it,
Yeah.
over and over. But even the true one cuppers, like Jimmy said, big congregation, they only fill their cup once or twice. And those who claim to be one cuppers, some of them, they have one for each section. They have 2 sets of pews. They're actually 2 cuppers because it kept one
Right.
side.
Right.
And it's ridiculous because nobody really drinks the cup.
Exactly.
Drink the content, and it's just a figure of speech. We still use matani.
And that's the response I would initially give, is that we're not drinking that cup. We're drinking the contents of it. That's what the Lord was referring to, was the contents of the cup, not the physical cup itself. That would be hard to digest, and only one person probably could eat it. Anyways, anyone else? Anything else on the Lord's Supper? It's not. I've heard people say this is the most important part of our worship. I kind of cringe at that. It is an important part of our worship. It's not the most important, because, how are you going to, prioritize the elements of our worship? It is important, and we see why here in this text, because it has significant impact on our spiritual condition if we don't do it properly. But it's not the most important. Now,
Mark, do we see that? When I first was attending the church, there were people that left, take communion, and they leave. I always get confused about that.
that's perfect segue. So, what about partaking of the supper? Singing a couple songs, sitting through a prayer, partaking of the Lord's Supper, and then leaving. Have you fulfilled the worship to God by doing that, by partaking of the Lord's Supper? And regardless of whether we say it's the most important part of our worship, by doing that, we are showing that we believe that. So, have we truly worshiped God just by fulfilling the obligation to partake of the Lord's Supper? Yes or no? No, we haven't. I mean, there are other elements that, there's teaching and preaching, so we have to be careful that we don't fall into that idea. And I believe they get it from the fact that, the Christians came together to break bread. They did, but they also came together to do other parts of their worship. Luke?
In regards to the one cup issue, and thinking back to the earlier chapters on eating meat off the idols.
Doing what?
Up in India, and they drink out of one cup, and they believe that it's the only way to do it. Would you agree that you would just drink out of one cup and not think that is more, as Paul says, destroying the faith of someone else?
Is there a problem with partaking of the fruit of the vine in one cup? No. I mean, if you want to pass around one cup, you know,
Get the first sip.
you know, I'd do it. I would do it. But at the same time, if I was there for any extended period of time, any time at all, I'd try to teach them, you know. And I think that teaching, that idea that the contents or the cup he's referring to is fairly simple, and if they're sincere and genuine, then they'll accept that. But yes, I would drink out of the same cup. There's nothing wrong with drinking out of one cup.
You know, there are a lot of congregations that try to accommodate rather than teach. I know there's one congregation, the leadership made communion the last thing they did because as soon as people took communion, they left. It sounded like the servants were back in the building, so they changed communion last. Instead of trying to, and also, a lot of people send their deacons out to serve communion to the shut-ins. You're leaving out all the other parts. But, you know, that's the emphasis instead of doing the teaching that they come to.
I'm glad you brought that up. You know, again, we say, or sometimes people say it's not the most important part of our worship, but, you know, I've been to a lot of nursing homes where, you know, the only thing the preacher or the teacher pulls out the communion set and, you know, the person partakes of the communion. Well, that's not worship. It's just part of our worship, but it's not worship. And unless you do it all, it's not pleasing to God.
I believe they're all connected for a reason, because how are you supposed to sing praises if you don't know why you're praising God?
Yep.
You know, why you even attend the congregation if you're not being taught to know why you're attending to begin with? Why you need salvation? It's all connected.
Yeah, it is. All right. Very good. Thank you for your kind attention.